But when does LSD come into play here? Where does LSD come from? How is it discovered?
It comes from Switzerland, from a chemist who had no idea what he was discovering because he was supposed to find, well, a stimulant, but a normal stimulant, like nothing that works on the mind, just something that raises your heartbeat and whatever, like something like amphetamine. That was his job. But when he synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide, which comes from ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye. He was quite surprised by the mental effects of the drug, and actually there were no physical effects. Like when he took the first dose of LSD to examine what it was, 250 micrograms, he had a very strong LSD trip, and he thought he would go insane. Albert Hoffman was his name, and he called his doctor, and the doctor came and he's like checked the pupils and the pulse and the heart rate and basically said, "You're fine. What's the matter with you? Are you faking it or something?" And he's like seeing all kinds of, like, the walls collapsing around him. So Hoffman didn't really know what it was, neither did the company Sandoz for which he was working, and neither did the CEO, who thought that Hoffman made a mistake with the dosage. But then eventually they understood that they had found the most potent substance in the world on the human mind, and then they tried to develop it as a medicine for mental health, basically, but they failed for reasons that I explain in Tripped.
Yeah, this part of the book was so funny to read. This guy Hoffman, he synthesizes LSD for the first time and he tried it on mice. And obviously, when you're trying a hallucinogenic drug on mice, you're not going to see any physical effects. So you're not really going to be able to tell it's working. So he tries it on himself. And I mean, could you say this was the first LSD trip in recorded history?
Yeah, because LSD didn't exist before, so it had to be the first LSD trip. I mean, the mice might have had a trip, but they didn't show it. We don't know if they didn't show it or whether they didn't have a trip. That will remain a mystery for all time. I don't know if it's really important whether these mice were actually tripping, but Hoffman certainly was. And since he didn't know what an LSD trip is, he thought it would go insane because he didn't know that it would end. He thought maybe this is now forever in his brain, this like different way of perceiving things. So it was probably quite an interesting trip. He called it a horror trip. I mean, there's good LSD trips, which are the majority, and bad trips, which are horror trips. But Hoffman said the horror trips are actually the best ones because they really change you unless you become psychotic and won't come back, which is actually very rare. This happens when people are quite unstable to begin with. So LSD is not for everyone, but I would say it's much safer than like alcohol or most of the other drugs. But there are also risks involved, so you have to be a little bit informed about it. That's also why I wrote Tripped. So if you read Tripped, you pretty much after that you can take LSD. You pretty much know enough about it, unless if you have psychosis or whatever, maybe then you should consult a doctor and maybe do it with a therapist. But he was fine. He after 8 hours it stopped, and then he wrote about it and he found it fascinating, and he actually believed then that the whole company should be remodeled and just produce psychedelic medicines, which is like the dream of every psychedelic researcher today, to have this. But also Hoffman wasn't able to do it because the CEO didn't like it, because he had pressure from the CIA not to do it, because the CIA was already interested in LSD as a potential truth drug in the Cold War.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that. But can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? Because he had no clue what he was getting into when he first tried LSD. And he actually took a huge dose because LSD is a very potent drug. So you only need a very small dose in order to feel the effect. So he took what he thought was a normal dose and had a massive trip. So I mean, I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been. And you're right, because if he's, deep in this trip, he probably doesn't think it's ever going to end. So I mean, what was the story of his trip? With the infamous bike ride and all of that.
Well, when I was in the archives there at Sandoz, they showed me his original lab books, and you can like see how how he writes down the hour when he takes it, and then suddenly he can't write anymore because the trip gets too strong, like after 40 minutes. And he asks his assistant to bring him home, which she didn't really realize. She probably thought he was feeling a little bit queasy or uneasy, or so she suggested to take the bike because he had come by bike in the morning. So they bicycled home. This is every year on what is it, April 16 or April 19? It's a bicycle day everywhere in the world where people take LSD and then ride their bikes in paying tribute to Hoffman on his bike. So the bike trip was probably pretty radical through sleepy Basel, Switzerland in 1943. He was like, I don't know what he experienced on the bike. I mean, he was happy when he was home. And then the doctor came and said, "You're fine." But he said, "I'm not fine." He's like left his body and saw his body lying there. And so he had an out of body experience and was not prepared for this at all. It's actually kind of similar to what I experienced when I took LSD for the first time because I didn't know what it was. So I also had these kind of experiences because it was also very strong. Usually, the first trip you take is stronger than the following trips because your brain is not used to it. So the brain's really surprised by what suddenly happens and tries to kind of make sense of this. Because what happens is basically that the ego in the brain gets a little less energy, so the organizer of your daily life is a little bit reduced, and then other parts of the brain, they kind of when the cat's away, the mice will play. They start become very active, and then so they you construct like crazy thoughts maybe, or you're more creative. I'm like more creative. I can handle it. So, but if you can't handle it, maybe also you see things that are not there, hallucinations. So it can be quite challenging. Um, but in the end, it stops, after 8 hours. It stopped for Hoffman, and then he became very interested in it because he thought this is something that works so potently on the mind. Maybe if I take a smaller dose, then he started microdosing, which is, fashionable again. Um, and we know now that microdosing is like brain food, basically. It stimulates the brain in all the right ways. It's very healthy. It's just, LSD is different if you take a small dose, which you don't feel a lot. I mean, you feel it maybe like the coffee you're drinking right now, or whether you take a so-called hero dose, which then is a really psychedelic, often spiritual experience. But that's not the only way to take LSD. I think the healthy way is to start with small dosages and see if you like that feeling, if you like that stimulation in the brain, if you feel comfortable with it. But he didn't know, he didn't know what a 250 micrograms is. Today we know it's a hero dose. He thought it's a microdose, but it's very, it's the most potent stuff in the world.
God, that is so fascinating. I mean, that is hilarious that his experience there. But you mentioned the CEO, I believe Arthur Stoll. Um, he didn't want Hoffman to continue with LSD research. What was sort of the reaction in the scientific community once Hoffman kind of discovered LSD and started writing about it and talking about it? What was the reaction in the wider sense of LSD?
Well, the brain was very much a black box at the time. We had no idea what's going on in there. So scientists became very curious when Hoffman was describing um, that on LSD, uh, neuronal pathways seem to be changing, and it created like a boom in neuroscience up until the mid 60s when LSD became illegal. There was a lot of research. In the beginning, they called it, they thought that it kind of mimics a psychosis in the brain. So they were interested from that angle, but it's not really what happens on LSD. They thought it would be like a light you could shine into the brain and understand more about it, which it is. Um, so the research was very, there was a lot of research, like thousands of research papers were created in these first years of LSD research.
Yeah, people sort of thought it was like a miracle medicine at first, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, at Sandoz, they created an intoxication room, as they called it, and they invited employees of the company to go in there and test LSD, and everyone absolutely loved it. Secretary was sitting there typing away, like writing down their experiences, and people from the company, they just felt very good about themselves, felt like they got smarter, they could think more, they could think better, they could see their lives in a better context. They could also understand their role in the universe better. Like, these things tend to happen on LSD. Um, and I mean, it's interesting why they happen. No one knew at the time, so that's why they thought it's a miracle. It's basically, LSD is not a miracle. It just changes the brain chemistry, and that creates certain results. We know now how it works. They didn't know then. But the company realized that they have something very interesting on their hands, and especially uh, after they tested it on depressed patients in Zurich at a university clinic, and were very successful with these treatments, like depressed, paranoid, psychotic people taking LSD could suddenly be released because their mental illness got much better. So they thought this is like a game changer in terms of mental health. They thought they would make a lot of money with LSD.